can is icing up pretty good. It's getting so cold I can barely hold it. Oh yeah, and that is some cold AC right there, baby. So today I'm going to be replacing my AC compressor and condenser in my 2012 Honda Civic. I thought I'd bring you along for the ride. This is going to be considered the 9th generation 2012 to 2015 range. So I'll tell you what happened. I was riding down the interstate a few days ago and I smelled smoke. I thought it was the car in front of me until I realized that my AC was no longer cool. So I had a sneaking suspicion of what just happened. I pulled over, popped the hood, and I could definitely smell that burning smell. This is so indicative of an AC compressor burning up. I was thinking maybe it had also popped my belt off, but it did not. Once the compressor burned up, it just went ahead and started free spinning, and the belt was allowed to keep on spinning so I could get back home. So I'm going to show you the best way to determine whether your compressor is actually locked up or not if you're ever in doubt. And what happened to me doesn't happen so drastically in your case. With my case, it was pretty obvious. But if you ever wonder whether your compressor's locked up, here's what you do. So you want to get you a 14mm wrench and tie a string to it, because you're going to drop it about 3 or 4 times if you're like me. There's not enough clearance for a ratchet and socket down there at this point because I haven't taken anything apart just yet. So open-ended wrench works well. Okay, and it's going to be really hard for me to show you this and hold the camera at the same time. The nut on the front of that compressor, which is right there in the center of your screen, that's what we're going to put the 14mm wrench on, and we're going to see if we can turn it. Okay, now I'm going to fish my wrench down there. And there it goes, I dropped it. And it doesn't fall straight to the bottom either, that's why it's good to have a string on it. Okay, I've got it engaged on the nut on front of the compressor, and I'm just going to see if I can turn it. And I'm pulling it that way towards the back of the car, and I cannot move it that way at all. And just for giggles, let me see if I can move it in the other direction. There's just not much room to work down here. Okay, so now I'm pulling the wrench that way towards the front of the car, and I actually am able to turn it just a little bit, but only about 90 degrees or so, and then it locks up in that direction too. So that tells me for sure that my compressor is locked up and I need to replace it. Sometimes when a compressor locks up like this, people call it hand grenading. So it basically locks up and explodes almost on the inside, and it sends little shards of metal through the system. So not only do I need to replace the compressor, but I also need to replace the condenser. I'll show you that a little bit more in detail in a minute. Technically, you can get away with just replacing the receiver dryer portion of the condenser, but in my case, the cost is very reasonable just to go ahead and replace the condenser. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the condenser as well. With the mileage and the age that I have on my car, there has been a considerable amount of wear and tear down at the bottom of the condenser, which you'll see later on from where rocks and everything have been hitting the bottom of it. So it just makes sense at this point to go ahead and replace the condenser. Not only will I be replacing the condenser, but I'm going to have to replace the expansion valve, which is underneath the dash. Whenever a compressor burns up and locks up, those are the 2 things that need to be replaced along with your compressor to make sure that the little metal shavings that the compressor has sent all through the system, that gives you assurance that those little metal pieces are not going to come back and damage your new compressor. So let's get to it. The very first thing I'm going to do is raise the car up just a little bit. Okay, so before we begin, let's cover a couple of safety things. Safety glasses are always a good thing to have when you're working on a car, and I like gloves as well. It keeps unwanted fluids away from your skin and can actually help you grip things a lot better. Okay, so I got the vehicle raised up in the air just a few inches on both sides. And while we're talking about safety, always use jack stands, set your parking brake, and chock your rear wheels. And now the main reason that I have the vehicle up in the air a few inches is because I'm pretty tall, and it makes the car a lot easier to get to when it's a little bit closer to where I am vertically. But also there's going to be some things that I need to access from the bottom of the vehicle while I'm doing this repair. And it just makes it a lot easier if we just get it up off the ground just a little bit. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the refrigerant that's in the system. When your compressor locks up, like what mine did, you still have refrigerant in the system. So what needs to happen, and what I did, is I took it to a local shop and I had all the refrigerant reclaimed. And most shops will do this at no cost because they benefit by reusing your refrigerant. And that is the stage that I'm at right now. The refrigerant is out of my system, and now I'm ready to remove components. But don't skip that step, because it's not good for the environment to let refrigerant out into the atmosphere, which is what will happen if you just start removing components without having the refrigerant properly evacuated. So what we need to do now before we start doing anything is we need to disconnect the negative post on the battery. That's a 10mm socket. We're just going to lay that off to the side. This will prevent arcing when you start taking off wires, which can damage components really quick. Next thing we need to do is we need to start taking our alternator off, because to get down to our compressor, the alternator needs to be out of the way. And to take the alternator off, of course, we got to take the serpentine belt off. It's going to require a 19mm wrench. Put it right there on that tensioner. Sometimes it's a little bit tough with just a wrench. If you lock two wrenches together like that, you'll get a little bit more leverage if you're having trouble releasing the tension off of that belt. And it's always a good idea to notate and even maybe pencil on a piece of paper which way the belt routes around the pulleys, just so you'll know when it comes time to put it back on. Okay, so without further ado, let's get this belt off. And I am having to use my little trick of putting two wrenches together. That makes it a lot easier when you have that additional leverage. It's got to be pulled counterclockwise. Then the belt just comes off, slides off the alternator pulley. Okay. And just so you'll have it, here's a rough sketch of the belt routing. Here's your crank pulley, your water pump pulley, AC compressor, there's your alternator, idler pulley, tensioner pulley. And see, this is why it's a good idea to make a diagram, because I just about messed up. I thought that belt come around this way off the alternator, but it drops straight down to that AC compressor. So hopefully that'll help you if you get mixed up a little bit when it comes time to put the belt back on. Next thing to do will be to take our connector apart. This is actually fastened on the side of the alternator, but this actually goes down to your AC compressor. Stick a little pocket screwdriver in there and twist, and the connector will pull off. Okay, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little tab that you pull this way, and then the other part of that connector will release off of the alternator, just like that. Next thing is to remove our heavy alternator wire, which is going to be another 10mm nut. Once that nut is removed, that'll come right off. I'm going to put that nut right back on that stud so I don't lose it. Okay, then your connector right here pulls out. It's just a tab that matches this way and it comes out like that. Now we want to release this cable hole off of this bracket right here, which is no more than taking a little pocket screwdriver, pressing this, and then it'll come right off. Okay, so to remove the alternator, you're going to need a 12mm socket, and it's got two bolts. One right here is pretty easy to show you. It helps if you have a deep well socket, either that or a shallow with maybe an inch or two extension. And we're just going to take that off. If it gives you trouble like it's giving me, you can get you a socket with an extension on it, put it right onto the end of your socket wrench, and then that way to give you a little bit more leverage. Just like that, although I lost my socket wrench. Okay, socket wrench recovered. Now I can easily take that bolt out. Okay, that's the first one. Second one I'm going to have to take off and show it to you after I take it off, because it's just about directly underneath that alternator pulley. But it's still going to be a 12mm. Okay, I can at least show you that I got the socket wrench on the bolt down there. Got my little leverage device on. Okay. And I learned that time I held on to the ratchet instead of letting it fall. Okay, now I can reach down there and get that bolt out with my fingers. Okay, second bolt removed. A little bit shorter than the other one. I'm going to put it up there where we won't lose it. And now your alternator should wiggle right out. If it doesn't, you may need to persuade it with a pry bar. But in my case, I think it's going to come right out. And there it is. So I will tell you, if you ever have to replace your alternator, make sure you take that heat shield off and put it on the new alternator. But we don't have to mess with that right now. Alternator removed. On to the next step. Okay, so now we're looking down at the bracket where the alternator fastens to, and we're going to have to take this bracket out of the way so we can get down to our compressor. There's 3 bolts. There's a 12mm there, one there, and then one underneath this bracket that's hard to see. Okay, first bolt. Okay, that one broke loose pretty easy, so I'll take it out by hand. Again, I just always like to put bolts back in their place if all possible. This helps me not lose them. And the same thing, take that one off, and I'll get the one underneath it as well. Okay, that's a nice long one there. And actually I forgot, this bolt down here at the very bottom of the bracket is easier to remove once you take the lines off the compressor. I could finagle a swivel with some extensions to get in there, but it's just easier to wait. So that's what we'll do. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove our lines going to our compressor. So we have one nut that we need to take off right there, 10mm. And right there we have a bolt that we need to spin off of that line, so we can take that line off, also a 10 millimeter. And hopefully they won't be too hard to get off. It is a little tight. Try it with my other hand here. Okay. There it goes. Okay, so there shouldn't be too much pressure in here since the refrigerant has already been extracted. You might hear a little psh when you take the lines off, but shouldn't be much. Let's go ahead and take this nut all the way off. Okay, definitely want to put that somewhere where we're not going to lose it. And that line should come right off. Let's see. Kind of need to do your best to pull that thing straight out and not cock it just but so much as you're pulling it out. There it goes. There still was a little pressure in there. I guess it's inevitable. Okay, and I'm just going to set that line back down there for a minute while I take the other one off. Now this one's going to be a little bit harder to film and take off at the same time just because it's kind of at a funny angle. But it's the same process. Same deal. This bolt right here is giving me a run for my money. I'm having to break out my 3/8 inch ratchet on this one with a universal joint on it so I can get some leverage on it. I'm still going to have to put the camera down now. I've got to use 2 hands for it. Finally got it broken loose. And just got to take that bolt out now. It's coming out nice and easy now. Okay, there's that one. And again, we're going to pull straight out. Okay, a little bit of pressure on that side too. Now what I'm going to do is, before I go too much further, I'm going to take a clean paper towel and I'm going to plug these 2 lines so trash won't work its way up into the lines while we're working. Okay, just like that and just like that. I've got this line curled up out of the way behind the valve cover. So the next step is to remove this bolt on the lower part of this bracket that I couldn't get to earlier. Okay, 12 millimeter. Oh yeah, that makes it a little easier. I can get to that bolt nice and straight on. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad at all. Okay, I think I can get that with my fingers now. Very nice. Now that whole bracket comes off, and now the compressor has a clean path to come out. And just to show you how I stay organized, I'm just going to put this bracket over here on my bench. That way I can't get mixed up. And I got my alternator sitting over here too. Put the bolts back where they're supposed to go. That way, again, I won't get mixed up when it comes time to put everything back together. Okay, so now we have to take the compressor off by removing 4 bolts. The 2 on the top are pretty obvious. One there and one there. One on the bottom, I've got my socket on it just so you can kind of see where it is. But it's at the very bottom, hard to see, but pretty easy to get to. But it's just hard to show you on the camera. So I'm going to remove the 4 bolts, and then the compressor should come right off. Okay, let's take this bolt out. This is also a lower one, but it's a lot easier to get off than the other one, just because I can see it a little bit better. Okay, there's that one. Okay, so the bottom bolt's removed. Now we just have to work on these top 2 bolts. A little tight. Go ahead and break this one loose too. A little snug. There we go. Okay. Now I can probably get them out with my fingers. And the last one. Alright. Okay, and as you can see, it just kind of hinges right there. I just got to wiggle it and it'll pull straight out. I do have to use both hands though. Okay, I just had to turn it vertical to get it out. And there it is. She's out. Okay, so I've got the compressor on the bench now. We can take a little closer look at it. Once we have it out, we can see it a little bit better. You can actually see the burn marks where once the compressor locked up and the clutch was still engaged, trying to activate the compressor, it just simply burned this clutch up, and you can actually see the little char marks on the end of that clutch where it just burned up trying to hold that compressor engaged and it just wouldn't turn. Now, since we got it off, a little bit better access to it, I'll try to rotate it again just so you can see. It should freely spin in both directions, and it's not turning that direction at all. Let's go clockwise. So it'll rotate just a little bit, and then lock up again. So that is toast. And what got me home was that pulley still was able to free spin, which means the belt stayed on the engine and didn't pop off, and that means I could get back home. There are times when a compressor burns up, locks up, that pulley just locks up with it, then you can't get home because your belt is no longer on your engine and won't turn your water pump and all the other good stuff like your alternator. But most of the time when this happens, that pulley will still free spin, so at least you can get home. Now, one other thing I will say that I forgot to mention to you when I was taking the compressor out of the engine bay, if you do have to hold the compressor vertical to wiggle it out, which I did, I wound up having to maneuver it and hold it vertical just to wiggle it out of the engine bay. Do it quickly because the oil will start to come out of these ports right here and will make a mess. That's one little tidbit I wanted to share with you. Okay, so let's put this one aside and take a look at the new compressor that I'll be using. Okay, so I decided to go with the R&Y compressor. I've heard really good things about the company, and I decided to give them a try. I got this right off of Amazon, and of course I'll leave a link to it below. This box come wrapped in a thick wall bubble wrap, so I'm very impressed over that. Not only that, but then this whole thing was put in a double-walled cardboard box. So very securely packed, very impressed so far. Okay, bubble wrap is off. Very well protected. Alrighty. Okay, and this is what we got. Okay, so you always want to inspect to make sure that the pulleys are the same. Want to make sure that your mounting holes are the same. And most important, you want to make sure that your connectors are the same, which they are. So you know it's going to fasten up to your wiring harness. Okay. And then make sure that the compressor spins nice and free, which it does. So that's a vast improvement from my old one. Okay. Oh, and of course you want to make sure that your ports are the same, which they are. So it looks like it's very high quality. I'm very impressed, and I did go with a new compressor and not a remanufactured. AC compressors are just one of those things where I always recommend going with a new component instead of a rebuilt one. It's just not worth the risk, and the difference in cost between a reman and a new one is really not that much anyway. Totally worth it to go brand new. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take these caps off of these ports. Now you may hear a little bit of a pop when you take these caps off because they're suctioned in there. This is a 10 millimeter, by the way. It's in there pretty good. Well, that's a good thing. There it goes. Yeah, it had a little pop when I pulled that cap off. And the reason being is they pressurize it before they ship it, just to kind of let the customer know that it is a sealed unit and ready to go. Same thing on this one. Okay, same thing, kind of hear a little pop. Most of the suction was on that first one though, because once you take that one off, it equalizes the insides of the compressor. So therefore you're not going to hear that much of a suction pop when you pull the second port off, whichever one you decide to take off first. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to pour the compressor oil out because I want to measure out how much they put in here before they ship it. They come pre-filled. That's one of the selling features of these new compressors. But I want to make sure that the correct amount is in there. So what I'm going to do, get me a little measuring cup. And I'm going to tip it right over and see if I can catch the oil without making a mess. There it comes. And I'm just going to let this drain for a bit. And then once it starts to dribble, I'm going to rotate the compressor. See if I can get the last little bit out. And you want to make sure you're spinning the compressor, not just the pulley on the front. And you'll know you're spinning it because you'll kind of hear a little gurgling noise. Yep, there comes some more. Rotate it a bit more. Then when you're doing this, you want to make sure you get it all out. Alright, I think that's about it. Okay, so I'm satisfied. I got all the oil out, and it looks like we are just above 50 milliliters, or spin these little cups around and tell you ounces on this side, just above 2 ounces. I like these little disposable cups. They come in very handy. Matter of fact, I'll leave a link to these little measuring cups down in the description if you're interested. Anyhow, this is the reason why you want to take it out and measure it, because I know that the specification for this compressor on my car, which is a 2012 Honda Civic, is between 75 milliliters milliliters and 85 milliliters. So that's what I'm going to put in there. I'm probably going to go towards the low end of that. It calls for 75 to 85. I'm going to go towards the low end, 75 milliliters, simply because there might be some residual oil still in here that I didn't get out, although I'm pretty sure I did get it all out, but just to be safe, I don't want to overfill it. And I assume that this is PAG 46 oil. I don't know that for certain. So what I'm going to do is put that aside, and since I know my car requires PAG 46, I'm going to put in my own oil, which is this PAG 46, and I want to put in a little bit of UV dye anyway, just in case I have a little leak in the future. I'll be able to identify it really quick. So I've got a fresh cup, and I'm going to pour 75 milliliters. And of course, we got a seal. You always want to make sure you use a fresh bottle of this stuff. And we're going to pour 75 milliliters in my cup here. Okay, that's at 70. I'm going to do it just a tad above 70. That's going to be 75, maybe close to 80. But you got to know some of that oil is going to hang onto the sides of the cup when you're pouring it. And that is neon green, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to say that's 75 milliliters. It's a little bit above that. But if you look on the other side of the cup, you can tell that it's really close to 3 ounces. I'm going to say 2 3/4 ounces. So if you're measuring by ounces, we're going to say 2 3/4 ounces. If you're measuring by milliliters, we're going to say 75 milliliters, maybe 80 milliliters. But we're well within range. And I'm going to go ahead and give a shout out to the off-roading mechanic, a YouTube buddy of mine, who give me the specifications on how much compressor oil to use. I'll put a link to his channel down in the description if you want to check him out. He's a very good resource if you're working on Honda vehicles. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour the oil right in these ports. And let's see if I can do it without making a mess. So far so good. I'm going to pour a little in that one. And I'm going to pour a little in this other port as well. Okay, so now we know we have the correct amount of PAG 46 oil in my compressor. No doubt about it. Now I'm going to take a clean paper towel. I'm just going to wipe off the face. Got to make real certain that you don't get any dirt in these ports at this point in the game. You'll notice I put on a fresh pair of gloves too, because my other gloves were getting dirty. Definitely do not want to get any dirt in these ports. Now I'm going to take my caps and I'm going to put them right back on. That way I know I won't get any dirt in here when I'm installing it. And also the oil won't go everywhere if I have to turn this thing vertical to wiggle it in, which I'm pretty sure I will, since I had to turn the old one vertical to get it out. Put this one back on. You don't have to tighten them down just so much, just snug them up. Okay, now I know we have 75 milliliters of PAG oil installed, and now the compressor is ready to be put back on the car. And so the one last thing I'll say about compressor oil is that if you're totally in the dark about how much oil to put in your new compressor and you don't have the specifications for your car, whatever it is that you're working on, what you can do is drain the oil out of your old compressor after you take it off, provided that you haven't spilled any. Measure the quantity of oil that comes out of your old compressor and put that exact amount into your new one. Then you're going to be well in the ballpark of the correct quantity. So I just wanted to share that little tidbit of advice for you as well. Okay, let's get this compressor put on. Okay, so back under the hood of the car, one neat thing that the Honda engineers did, which I'm very grateful for, is that they provided a little shelf, a little hinge for your compressor to hinge on, and it makes it a lot easier to install it. So really all we have to do to begin with is we just have to put those pins within that little hinge and let it swing down. And then after we get that part done, then it's just a matter of putting our bolts in. Those are the 2 notches I was telling you about that I have to seat in that hinge to let it swing down. Okay, now it's just a matter of putting it in reverse order. Let's kind of go ahead and get it vertical. Just letting it go in back in first. Kind of got to walk it past that water pump. Got to make sure you don't pinch your wiring harness when you're doing this. Go ahead and get it horizontal. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so that's sitting in place very nicely. So lovely how that just hinges on those little cleats. Now I will tell you one thing that helped me put it in is making sure that this damper, which is part of your tensioner, make sure that that piece is up out of the way and not falling down like that. That'll help you get your compressor in place. Now all I got to do is just put my bolts in. And if you'll notice, out of my 4 compressor bolts, 2 are larger, 2 are relatively smaller. The 2 larger ones go in the top, 2 smaller ones go in the bottom. And just double check that your wiring harness is not pinched. And it's a good idea to go ahead and get all your bolts started before you start tightening things down. Okay, that one started. Now for the other one that you can't see, I'm going to have to put the camera down for this one, I think. Okay, now I got all my bolts started, the ones on the bottom included. And that's just a matter of taking my 12mm socket wrench and tightening them down. What I generally like to do, especially when you have a 4-bolt system like this, is tighten them down in a zigzag pattern. So like tighten this one, then tighten one on the bottom right, then tighten the top right, and then tighten the bottom left. And then go back and forth like that in a zigzag pattern until you get everything tightened down. What I generally do is I'll tighten these all the way down until they hit the face, and then I'll tighten them about maybe another 1/4 to a 1/2 turn. You just want to snug them up. They need to be tight enough, but they don't need to be super tight. You are driving these into aluminum threads. And just a note, you get to the ones on the bottom, you're going to need your deep well socket. A shallow well will not do it. And on that lower left bolt, I have to put my universal joint on there with my deep socket just to give me another inch of reach. I don't have an extension that short. Makes it a little cumbersome, but it works. Probably go back and tighten that one more time down there. And just roughly following that zigzag pattern. Okay, and like I said, I'll go back and I'll run through them 1 or 2 more times just to make sure they're all tight, and that'll be that. Okay, so the next thing we got to do is we need to put our lower part of our alternator bracket on before we go any further. And the reason we have to do that, remember, the lower bolt on that bracket, which is the one in the center of your screen, has to be accessed before we put our low pressure refrigerant line on right here. Once that low pressure refrigerant line goes on, we won't have access to that lower bolt very easily. So that's why the bracket has to go on first. Then we'll come back and we'll put our low pressure and high pressure refrigerant lines on. Now do yourself a little favor and go ahead and clean up this bracket before you put it on with a little parts cleaner. And the reason being is since those refrigerant lines go directly under that bracket, you definitely don't want any dirt falling off this bracket into your ports when you're trying to put your lines on. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Okay, putting on our clean bracket. I'm going to attach our tensioner damper. I'll just tighten all those bolts. 12mm. Alright, it's coming together. And now that we have all of our bolts tight, especially that one down there we were talking about, now we can go about the business of putting our refrigerant lines on. Okay, so it's time to put our refrigerant lines on. You're going to need to get you a pack of O-rings like this. The compressor does not come with O-rings. Neither will the condenser that I'll be replacing here in a little while as well. So this is a pack of O-rings you can pick up. It pretty much contains every O-ring that you would need in a Honda AC system for this particular 9th generation Honda Civic. And it applies for other Hondas as well, but you just have to check the part number. I will leave a link to this down below so you can pick up a pack of these as well. And again, you can pick them right up on Amazon. So we need to find the O-rings that match the ones on the refrigerant lines. So let's do that. Okay, so let's look at our low pressure line first. It's a real good idea to get you something like this. It's just a simple pick. Really good for getting these O-rings off. Just got to stick it in there, get underneath that O-ring. Makes it super easy to get off. I'm just going to take my piece of paper towel out for now. And there it is. And same thing with my high pressure line. And get my pick underneath that O-ring. And then it'll roll right off that lip, just like that. I'll go ahead and take that piece of paper towel out. And then there's that one. Okay, so now it's time to select the proper O-rings. And I put on another fresh set of gloves because you do not want to get any dirt at all on these O-rings. Okay, I'm thinking that that one is good for the low side line. And that looks like a perfect match for the high side line. Okay, and now I'm going to take a Ziploc bag and I'm going to pour just a little bit of PAG oil in the bag. Okay. And now I'm going to drop my new O-rings right in that bag. And I'm just going to mix it around a little bit, making sure that they are coated in that oil. And I'm just going to let them sit there and marinate for a couple of minutes. It's imperative that they get coated on 100% of the surface before they get installed. Okay, so I'm going to work with my high side line first. I'm going to take a clean paper towel and I'm just going to wipe around this fitting really well so it's nice and clean. Also going to go ahead and just wipe the sides of the fitting on the top just to get any dirt off of it I can. And I'm going to take another clean paper towel and just wipe that male fitting. Just going to go inside the compressor one more time before I put my O-ring on so I know it's nice and clean. And I'm going to take my smaller O-ring that's been marinating because that's the one for my high side line. And I'm going to carefully roll it onto the groove. And it goes on pretty easily after it's been soaking in that oil, which is the goal. Now I'm going to carefully set this out of the way so it's not touching anything. And now I'm going to take my cap off of my high side port, 10 millimeter. Okay, I'll just let that little rubber cap separated from the metal plate, which is no problem. Okay, so back to our old compressor, we need to use this stud on the new compressor to hold down our high pressure line. If you have an inverted Torx bit, that makes it really easy. You could just spin it out with an inverted Torx, but I don't. So I'm just going to double nut it with a couple of 10 millimeter nuts that I have lying around. Okay, then we just double nut it. It means just locking two nuts in place like that. And then you can take your wrench and easily remove that stud. Sometimes you gotta work with what you got. Just like that. And now we will go put this in our new compressor. Okay, so now we'll just run that stud down and drive it into place. I don't know why that the high side uses a stud and the low side doesn't, but we're just going to go with what the original compressor had on it. I could simply drive a bolt in there. Matter of fact, I could use the bolt that was holding that cap on, but there's got to be a reason there was a stud there on the original compressor, and it does help to align your line back into place. That's why I'm going to the trouble to put the stud in the new compressor. I just take my 10 millimeter and just tighten it up. Okay, that's all it is to it. Now all I got to do is just remove my two nuts that I have locked onto the threads. Okay, I got my clean gloves back on, and I'm going to take a very clean paper towel, and I'm just going to wipe the face where this line is going to mount to. And now, since everything is nice and clean, it's time to pull our plug out. Okay, now this is where you don't want to breathe too heavy because you do not want any dirt getting into that port whatsoever. And now with just a little bit of PAG oil on my fingertip, I'm going to come down here and lubricate this port really well. And now I'm going to carefully set my high pressure refrigerant line right over that stud, and we're going to press down firmly. And you should feel like a little snap. Just like that. That way you know that O-ring is seated and is not rolled. If you don't feel that snap, that means something is amiss. We're going to take our nut and we're just going to run it right down that stud. Okay, grab our 10 millimeter and we're just going to tighten it down. Don't use anything more than a 1/4 inch ratchet. You just want to snug it up. Now, one thing I'll say is make sure that your iron harness is on this side of that high pressure line. Okay, so I got my line snugged up, and the torque spec is actually 7.2 foot-pounds for both that nut and the bolt that's going to hold down our low pressure line. So I've got an extension and my torque wrench, got it set at 86 inch-pounds, which is pretty much the equivalent of 7.2 foot-pounds. And we're just going to tighten it down. Okay, that'll do it. It doesn't take much. I do think it's important to torque down these lines if you have the means to do so, but if you don't, just snug them up pretty good with a 1/4 inch ratchet and you'll be okay. Just don't overdo it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on attaching our low pressure line. We're going to take our cap off. Okay, there goes that bolt, and the plate is going to come off. Okay, and again, we want to breathe very carefully because we don't want to drop any dirt or debris in there. Okay, I've got my low pressure line here. I've already taken a clean paper towel and I've wiped all around here. I've got my O-ring and I'm just going to walk it around the groove on that line. And it'll just snap right into place, just like that. Okay, I've got a little bit of hag oil on my fingertip, and same as the other port, I'm just gonna make sure the inside of that port is nice and lubricated with oil. And now, as carefully as I can, I'm gonna maneuver my line into place and press it down firmly. I'm gonna push it straight in, and there's that snap that you want to hear. Just kind of pops into place, and you know that you did something right. Now we're just gonna take our 10mm bolt, and we're just gonna thread it into position. And this is why you wanted that bracket right there to be nice and clean, because you didn't want any dirt to fall down in that hole while we were trying to put that line into place. And grab my 10mm, just gonna snug it up. Okay, and I'm gonna grab my torque wrench. And in this case, I find it easier just to get a couple of extensions with the universal joint down at the bottom, and I can easily attach my torque wrench up top. Okay, I've got it set to 86 inch-pounds, and that's it, properly torqued. And while we're talking about torque specs, if you're interested, the specs to these mounting bolts are 16 foot-pounds. I generally just get a feel for those when I'm putting those in. I think it's more important to get your torque specs in line for your lines than I do for anything else. But just so you know, if you do want to know the torque specs to these 4 hold-down bolts, they're going to be 16 foot-pounds. And just a little tidbit of information for you, in case you didn't know, when you're not using your torque wrench, make sure you run it all the way down to its lowest setting, because there's a spring inside that will wear out prematurely if it's left tensioned. Okay, so far so good. We've got the compressor installed. All we have to do now is go back together with the alternator and the drive belt. And so far I would tell you that I'm pretty impressed with the quality and the compatibility with this compressor to my car. It's exactly like, in just about every way, the OEM compressor. One thing I will mention while I have it on my mind is when you're ordering your compressor, you do have to specify that you have a 4-door or either a coupe, because there is little differences in your AC parts. So just word to the wise. Mine is a standard Honda Civic 2012 4-door sedan with the 1.8, and this very compressor will work on 2012 through 2015. And it'll work on other applications as well, but I know it'll work on those years if you have a Honda Civic 1.8, not a SI, and a 4-door sedan. And I will, of course, link to the compressor that you can buy on Amazon if you're interested. Okay, so let's get this alternator installed. It's going to go right back in the same way it come out. I'll go ahead and put this piece on the block, kind of act as our hinge. You gotta wiggle it in there. You gotta get that started, finger tight. Before I go too much further, I need to get the one down at the bottom, the one that you can't see. I need to go and get that one started before I start tightening down on this one at all. So it's kind of hard to see, but I want to show it to you. There's the alternator, and right in the center of your screen there is the head of the bolt. I've got it started, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a socket on it, and I'm going to see if I can get it finger tight. So with my 12mm deep well socket, I could just grab it with my fingers and tighten it up with my hands. Now I'm going to tighten it the rest of the way down, almost, with my socket wrench. And then I'll come back and tighten down on my top one. Okay, just tightening up the top one now. And again, if you want to put a torque wrench on here, you can. It's going to be 17 foot-pounds if you have a torque wrench. I just like to do these by feel. I've done them enough. Okay, snugging up to one on the bottom. Yeah, I think that's about good. Okay, and now we just got to hook up our terminal and our connectors. So our new harness going down to our AC compressor has new hold downs on them already. So we need to take the old ones out. And you can do that by just getting a pocket screwdriver. You just have to squeeze the tabs on both sides and they'll pop out. And then once you get both of them out, you can slide those other ones right in on the new harness. Okay, the old clips are out. And this just pushes right in. Should just hear like a little snap. There it is. It's pretty neat that they include new hold down clips on here. And there's a very good reason why you want to make sure that wiring harness is secure, because here's your exhaust manifold, and that gets really, really hot. So if that wire gets close to the manifold, it's bye-bye AC compressor. Okay, and that clips right onto there, nice and secure. And then we put our connector from our wiring harness. There it is. It's important to hear that little click. That way you know you got an airtight and a watertight connection. Next thing is to put our big wire going to our alternator on this terminal right here. Take off our 10mm nut, peel back our insulation, and that just slides down there just like a puzzle piece. And then we're just going to tighten that down. Again, this is just 10mm, and we're just going to snug it up. Make sure your boot goes back down over it and pops into place. The wiring harness over here snaps into place, and our little wiring harness cable tie pops on that metal bracket sticking up from the alternator. Only thing left to do is put our belt on now. And again, if your belt has come all the way off, go back, check your belt routing diagram, and refresh your memory. Okay, now here's a little trick I learned. Get you a bungee cord, and that way it'll act as the third hand for you. Get everything routed with your belt around the lower pulleys to where the only thing left to put on is your alternator pulley, and then get your bungee cord and hold it in that position. That way it won't slip off those bottom pulleys. Okay, we got our 19mm wrench down there on our tensioner, and then we just have to do a bit of prying before we can wiggle that belt onto the alternator pulley. And I've got my second wrench added on for a little leverage here. And now we just got to use a good bit of force here to wiggle the belt on. It does take quite a bit of force, but when you have a second wrench on here, it does make it a lot easier. Try it from a little different angle here. You definitely do not want to get your fingers between the belt and that alternator pulley in case something slips. That's for sure. There it goes. I'm not gonna lie, that was a little strenuous. They do make a special tool for that. It's a big long wrench you can buy. It gives you a whole lot of leverage. I may look into getting one of those, but we managed this time. Okay, belt installed. You just need to make sure that your belt is on every pulley and it's not hanging off to the side on any pulley, and you'll be okay. Okay, so the compressor is completely installed. Alternator back on, belt on. We can take a moment to congratulate ourselves for the work we've done so far. And if you were in a situation where you only needed to replace your compressor because of it just malfunctioning and not producing the correct amount of pressure, or if it was just leaking, then you wouldn't need to do what I'm about to do. But since my compressor locked up, I'm going to need to replace the condenser, which is in front of the radiator, because the particles from a locked up compressor shoots through the system and it contaminates a lot of things. And since the condenser is next in line, or I guess you could say downstream from the compressor, that's the first thing that's contaminated. And yes, I could replace just the receiver dryer that's on the end of the condenser, but I'm going to do the whole thing because, like I say, it's not much more cost-wise than it is to replace the receiver dryer. So let's get to work getting this condenser out. Okay, to access the condenser, I'm going to have to take the front bumper off, and I'm going to show you how I do that. So first things first, I need to take off this cover, and it's just a series of clips. Okay, these little clips come up pretty easily. Take a little pocket screwdriver, just pop them up, and just take a larger screwdriver and come up just like that. And pocket screwdriver first, get in there, kind of get it started with that, and then it'll pop up, pull it up, and then get my bigger screwdriver in there. And it comes right out. Of course, they do make a special tool for this, but I don't have that, so a couple of screwdrivers work just fine. I'm gonna finish taking the other ones out. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, now we have an Allen head screw. This is a 5mm. We got one on either side, one over there as well. We just need to spin these out. Okay, and I'm going to remove this side. Okay, comes right out. And I will tell you, if you're working on like a 2014 or 15 model, you may be able to get by without removing the bumper by taking this piece off. I believe on those later models it separates right here by a couple of tabs. But unfortunately on the 2012 model, this fastens through the upper part of the bumper on the inside with clips that you can't access. So the bumper does need to come off on the 2012 model. But it's really not that bad of a job. Okay, now so underneath the car we have several, I'd say probably between 8 and 10 of these clips all underneath that we're going to need to take off the same way we took the ones off the top, just with my little screwdriver. Okay, I'm just going to repeat the process for all these clips. So as you're taking out these clips, sometimes you'll run across some that are extra long, you know, like this one. What I'll do is I'll put this in a special bag just to make my life a lot easier when I'm installing it, and then I'll just take a black marker, make a mark right there, just to let me know where those longer clips go. Just for instance, there's this one, and then back over here, there's one right there too. So I'm just going to put those longer clips in a bag so I'll know where they are, and then my mark will help identify their location. Okay, then once you've got all your clips out, then we're looking up under the wheel well on the driver's side, and there's a Phillips head screw right up there, and we're just going to take that out. Okay, and of course it's got one on the other side as well. And I'm going to use my bungee cord again for a third hand. That'll keep my bumper from falling on the floor. And we're just going to pull back our fender liner, grab our bumper, and give it a good pull. Okay, same thing to the other side. And now you can see where I've got that bungee cord there. Peel back the liner and grab the bumper, kind of keep this part pressed in, and then just work it around. I'm just going to remove my bungee cord. And there it is. Not too bad. Oh, and by the way, if you don't have one of these little lights when you're working underneath the car, you need to get you one. It makes things a whole lot easier. So now we have full access to the condenser. And now maybe you can see why I've opted to go ahead and replace it. This is what 12 years and 325,000 miles will do to a condenser. The fins are almost completely stopped up down here because the webbing in between has just been bent all to crap by all the rocks hitting it and everything else. So here's the receiver dryer. That's really what we need to replace, but literally as the time of this recording, the receiver dryer is about $40 and the whole condenser is about $75. So it makes a whole lot of sense to me to go ahead and replace the whole thing, because 9 times out of 10 this condenser is going to have to be replaced anyway within about, I would say, a year or two at the most. So let's get to work. Okay, so since we're already down here, we're going to take off this line first. This is actually our outlet going from the condenser back up and is heading to the evaporator. It'll be a 10 millimeter. Okay. Okay, and now this line should come out fairly effortlessly. Now it's important that you pull this straight out, like straight towards the front of the car, and not do any violent wiggling. You're going to have to do a little bit, but try to keep it minimal. And you'll hear a pop. It's coming. It's a little stubborn. There it is. And I'm just going to take my gloves off for right now because I don't have a pair of clean gloves within reach. I'm going to take a piece of paper towel like I've done the other ones. I'm just going to push it up into that line a little bit just to keep the dirt and debris from getting up into this line. And see, the reason you don't want to do a whole lot of wiggling back and forth when you're pulling this line out is because this is a fairly long male fitting that goes inside the condenser, and it could easily break off if it's torqued back and forth. Okay, so let's move up top. Let's go ahead and remove our upper line. This is our inlet. This is the one that's actually coming straight off the compressor. 10 millimeter. Make sure we don't lose those bolts. Okay, same deal. This line should pull straight out. If you got a wiggle, don't do it much. There it goes. That one come out a little easier. This one's a little bit dirty. I'm just going to knock a little bit of the dirt off of the side right while I'm here. Clean paper towel. And the line is protected from dirt and debris. Next thing is I'm going to take my horn out of the way. 12 millimeter. And since my bungee cord is still hanging right there, I will use it to assist. Now it's time to go ahead and take off my brackets. I got one on this side and of course one on the other side. These are 10 millimeter. These are the brackets that hold the condenser in place. Okay, the brackets come right off. And these little grommets as well. And now the condenser should lift straight out. You just have to work it past the hood latch. And there it is. And you'll need to take these grommets off the bottom on both sides because we'll need to reuse them. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and clean up down here a little bit. This little spot between the radiator and the condenser doesn't ever see the light of day. So it's a good time to get in there and just clean it out a little bit. Tell you what, the radiator will probably thank me. In a lot of ways, the condenser protects the radiator. That's why they put the condenser in front of the radiator, because if one of them has to get damaged or at the very least plugged up over the other one, the condenser is the one that needs to take the brunt of it. Because you can't get home if your engine starts to overheat, but you can if your AC stops cooling. I'll probably go get an air hose and just blow it off one good time, but I think that's a lot better. Okay, so I've decided to go with a condenser made by A Premium. You can find them right on Amazon and they're very reasonably priced. I've used their products before, so I know it's going to be good quality. Let's take it out of the box and compare it to our old one. Okay, it comes very well packaged. It has styrofoam blocks all the way around it, which is wonderful. It's sealed on both inlets. And like I was saying, it comes with the receiver dryer already on it. So much more cost effective to do it this way. And now just comparing it with the old one, all the places where the bushings go on are identical. Our ports line up on both the top and the bottom. Everything is exactly the same, except of course the new one looks a whole lot more pretty. Alright, let's get this installed. Alright, first thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and put my grommets on the bottom feet. And they're a nice snug fit so they'll stay in place. Now making sure that it's oriented the correct way, I'm going to lower it right back down. Kind of keeping it angled because my hood latch is there. Being as gentle as possible. And just making sure that those grommets sit right down there in the holes on the frame. So far, so good. Okay, working with the driver's side first. Put my grommet right back in place. I'm going to put my upper bracket. And I'm going to reinsert my 10mm bolt. Alright, nice and secure. Needs to be tight, but not too tight. Same thing on the passenger side. Grommet in place. And my upper bracket. Okay, that's all it is to it. Okay, we're going to put our horn back in place. Snug it up. Now while you're right here, you want to make sure there's some clearance between that connector going to your horn and the radiator. If it's ever gotten bent, you'll be able to see it now. If it gets up against that radiator, it's going to melt that connector. Okay, so now it's time to take our old O-rings off. And a little pick makes this so much easier. Just walk it off. Okay, I'm going to take a clean paper towel and then wipe the face of this mating surface on this pressure line, making sure there's no dirt present. You'll notice I put my clean gloves on again. Let's match up this O-ring here. I think that's a good match right there. A little bit more pag oil into my bag. And I'm going to drop that new O-ring in there and let it marinate for just a minute. While we're waiting for that O-ring to marinate a little bit, let's go ahead and take this cap off of our new condenser, the upper port. You'll probably hear a little pop. Yep, and the reason you hear that pop is because they pressurize the condenser before they ship it. That way the recipient knows that there's no leaks in this condenser. We'll get our O-ring out, and with clean hands, we're going to put this new O-ring on. I'm just going to walk it around the lip. And it'll roll right into place. And I'm just going to take a little bit of pag oil on my fingertip, stick it right in that port like that to make sure that that O-ring glides right in. Okay, then it just pushes straight in. You should kind of feel it pop, just like that. Just like when we put the lines on the compressor. We'll grab our 10mm bolt. Just going to snug it up. Okay, we're going to set our torque wrench for 86 inch-pounds. Just like that. Now we're just going to carefully torque it down. Okay, now I know it's a perfect 86 inch-pounds, which is 7.2 foot-pounds. Okay, so here we are down here at the lower line. Gonna use our pick to walk this old O-ring right off. Just like that. And I think before I even take that paper towel out, this time I'm gonna just wipe the mating surface from the face of this line. Now let's match up our O-ring. This one is a teeny tiny one. Okay, I think I found my match, and I got it marinating in my little baggie there. And make sure this plastic cover is clean of dirt and any grit that could fall down in this connection while you're working with it. I've already wiped this one down. Alright, I'm gonna pull my plug out. Okay. And I grab my new O-ring out of my bag that has been marinating, and I'm going to slide it on here. And I'm just going to carefully walk it around the end of my line here till it seats very nice in that groove. That one fought me a little bit more. I think it's just because it's so small. I'm going to coat the inside where my line is going to go with a little bit of oil. And we're just going to press it in straight, nice and firm. There it goes. I like to feel that little click. I'll run my 10mm bolt in there. Grab my torque wrench. Still got it set at 86 inch-pounds. Okay. Now I know it is torqued to specs. And everything looks good. So now both lines are nice and secure. Okay, and now we're at the point that we need to reinstall the front bumper cover. Just going to bring this around into position. I'm going to use my third hand here, the bungee cord, kind of hold it in place while I get it all situated. Kind of make sure these air direction dams stay in place on both sides and they don't roll or get pinched. And now down at the bottom, those little air direction dams have a tab that needs to go on the outside like that before you put your clip in it. Okay, then it just mashes in. Clip is done. And same thing on the passenger side. Alright, had to do that while I was thinking about it. Okay, then your bumper cover just pushes in. You'll feel it snap into place. I'll take my hand and I'll put it on the underside to give the fender some support. Got to make sure that your tabs are going into the grooves. Alright, then it just pops back into place just like that. Then we'll take our screw and we'll come up from the underside and secure that. Okay, this is the driver's side. You got to make sure that your hole lines up there when you're putting your screw in. And you just drive it on in. And this screw right here really serves as the cornerstone of holding your bumper cover in place. Very nice. Alright, do the same thing on the other side. Okay, on the passenger side now, make sure that our holes are lined up. And we're just going to drive our screw right up. Alright, nice and tight. Make sure your fender tucks back under your bumper cover there. And now it's nothing more than going through and putting your clips back all underneath your bumper. And my two longer clips, I put those on a separate bag so I know where to reach for them. Okay, that's all there is to it. Now I'm going to go through and just put in my other clips all the way down. Nothing to it. Okay, and last one will be that longer one. Okay, now we can move up top. Okay, now I can remove my bungee cord. And last thing to do is put my clips and my screws up here. Got my 5mm hex on each side. Okay, and now lastly our little clips here. Now if you ever break these clips, they do make kits that you can buy that have various clips in them for different types of vehicles. I'll see if I can find one for you and link in the description below if you want to check that out. Inevitably one or two will break. I've been lucky. Some of mine have broken, but not to the point where I can't use them. Okay, when they get age on them, they're going to break apart. Now it turns out I really didn't have to remove these four in the front, but it still gave me a little bit extra wiggle room when I was trying to get everything situated. Clip there, Clip there, there, and there. So the bumper cover is now installed. Okay, and now we can let the car down off of the jacks and the jack stands. Okay, and now the car is back on the ground. So now we've got our AC compressor replaced, we've got our condenser replaced, and now the only thing we have left to do is I need to replace the expansion valve, which is underneath the dash. If you'll follow your AC lines, high pressure and low pressure lines, all the way to the very back where it meets up with the firewall. That right there in the center of your screen is where the lines go through the firewall and it meets up with the expansion valve and the evaporator. So that is what I'm going to need to replace next. The expansion valve is the next thing in line down from the condenser with the receiver dryer that we just replaced. The expansion valve is the last thing that can stop up when a compressor locks up and goes kaplooey. So now what's a shame is that I have replaced this expansion valve about a year ago because I had a restriction in it and it wasn't allowing my system to cool. Once I replaced the expansion valve, everything worked fine. But now I got to replace it again, unfortunately, simply because I don't want to take the chance of my brand new compressor getting ruined because the remaining particles and debris that has been sent through the system as a result of my locked up compressor. So I got to replace it again. But I'm not going to go through the step-by-step on the expansion valve replacement simply because I've already done a video on it, and I'll make sure to link to that up above and down in the description below so you can check that video out as well, because to be on the safe side, that expansion valve does need to be replaced when your compressor locks up like mine did. So that's what we're going to do now. So here's an extremely brief synopsis of removing and replacing the expansion valve. First, you take the front seat out on the passenger side, throw it in the back seat, get it out of your way. The glove box has to come down. Then your air box is exposed. Air box has to come all the way down, all the way out. Okay, this whole great big air box comes down and out of the way. Now we have to jump back under the hood of the car and take off our lines that bolt to our expansion valve. And there's a stud right there in the center that we have to take out as well. That stud sits right in the expansion valve. Okay, stud removed. And now back underneath the dash, I've taken my screws out of this piece of ductwork. And now that can slide off and out of the way. And then there's our expansion valve. Evaporator slides out. Okay, with the evap core on my bench, now I'm going to take the old expansion valve off. I'm going with a Denso thermal expansion valve. I'm convinced they're the best. Okay, I got the new expansion valve installed with fresh O-rings. Okay, I've got fresh O-rings installed on my lines coming in that plug into the expansion valve. Expansion valve and evaporator back in place. Be careful to make sure that your temperature probe stays in place on your evaporator core. And one more tip for you, make sure that this seal along your box stays into place, because if that seal gets moved, then condensate from the evaporator can drain right on your floor. Okay, we got our ductwork installed back over our evaporator core. Being very careful not to pinch our wiring harness. There's a groove that wiring harness goes into. That's for our temperature probe. You need to make sure that wiring harness is seated in that groove so it's not pinched. Okay, we've got our stud put back in our expansion valve, and we torqued the stud at 86 inch-pounds or 7.2 foot-pounds. And also we've got our lines fastened to the expansion valve and the nut that runs onto that stud. We've got that torqued down also to 86 inch-pounds, or same thing as 7.2 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench, just snug it up pretty good with a 1/4 inch ratchet and just don't over tighten it. And back on the inside of the car, it's time to put our airbox assembly back up. Okay, I've got my airbox installed and got my connectors all connected back up, the glove box back in, and the front seat installed. Okay, so the expansion valve is now installed. I really do encourage you to go look at my other video that I'll leave a link to down in the description, to where there's much greater detail on how to replace this expansion valve. And I try to give you some tips and tricks on how to maneuver underneath that dash to help you along. So definitely go check out that video. Okay, so the next thing to do now is we have to pull a vacuum on the system, make sure there's no leaks, and then we're going to charge the system with the proper amount of refrigerant. Okay, and as with the expansion valve, where I did a separate, more detailed video, I have done a more detailed video on how to do a proper evac and recharge on your AC system. I'll link to that above, as well as I'll put a link down in the description below so you can find that. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to hit the highlights about this process, but you'll definitely want to go check out the other video if you're new to doing a proper evacuation of your system, where you're extracting all the moisture out of the system and then injecting the correct amount of refrigerant. So let's hit the highlights on what I'm doing. I've got my AC manifold gauge set hooked up, and I've also got it hooked to my vacuum pump. And then I'm going to crank open my low side manifold valve as well as my high side valve. And then you'll hear the pitch of that vacuum pump changing, because now it has access to the entire system once I've opened both my manifold valves. You'll notice both my gauges are reading down in the negative pressure readings. I'm going to let this sit under a vacuum for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to shut it off. Okay, my vacuum pump has been running for about 15 minutes, maybe 20. Now I'm going to close both my manifold valves, and then I'm going to shut my pump off. And you'll notice both my gauges are reading 30 inches of mercury. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the system sit for 45 minutes to an hour. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to see if my gauges are still in the same position. And that'll tell me whether I have a sealed system or not, or if I have a leak. Okay, so great news. It's been 1 solid hour and my gauges have not budged. They're holding 30 inches of mercury, both sides, which means I have a completely sealed system, and I can safely say that there are no leaks in my system. Okay, so now that I know that, now it is time to proceed on with my vacuuming. I'm going to pull a vacuum on my system for an entire hour to make sure I get all the air out and any traces of moisture in the system along with it. This process does require patience, but you can't rush it, because this is the right way to do it. Okay, turning my pump back on, and I'm going to open both valves on my manifold. And now I'm going to let the vacuum pump work for 1 solid hour. Okay, it's been a little over an hour, and now I'm going to shut my vacuum pump off. But before I do that, I'm going to close down my manifold valves. Make sure they're nice and tight. And now vacuum pump is off. So now I can safely assume that my system is completely free of any air and any moisture. And now I can proceed on with installing my refrigerant. I'm going to disconnect my lines from my pump. And your gauges should stay right where they are at 30 inches of mercury. If those gauges move when you disconnect your vacuum line, that means that you didn't shut your valves down good enough, and you'll need to repeat the vacuuming process. So ordinarily at this point we would just start adding our refrigerant, as in the video that I'll link to down in the description, where I go in much greater detail about a proper evacuation and recharge of an AC system. But in our case today, since we replace components, we need to add some PAG oil. Now I've already added some PAG oil to the compressor, but I still have to add a little bit more to compensate for the condenser that I replaced. Now each component of a vehicle has specific requirements for how much oil that you need to add. The condenser in my car, when replaced, requires that you add 50 milliliters of PAG 46. And I can thank the off-roading mechanic for that, because I asked him and he answered, and I was much appreciative of that. Again, I'll link to his channel down in the description in case you want to check him out. He's a great resource if you're working on Honda vehicles. Okay, so 50 milliliters. That is what's required for a condenser replacement on the 2012 to 2015 9th generation Honda Civic 4-door sedan, which if you want to flip that around is going to be just below 2 ounces. That's why I like these little cups. There's ounces on one side, milliliters on the other. If you want to get technical, 50 milliliters is approximately 1 2/3 of an ounce. So now how am I going to add this to my system? Well, there's a few ways that we can achieve that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it right here in my yellow hose. So I'm going to disconnect this end right here from my manifold. I'm going to put a wrench on it just to hold the nipple here still. And that just comes right off. And now with both ends of the hose up in the air like that, I'm going to use a little syringe, and it makes it so much easier to feed the oil down the hose. So I'm just going to grab some out of my cup here. And I'm just going to feed it right down my hose. And it's easier if you feed it through the end of the hose that we took off the manifold, because this fitting doesn't move up and down like on the other end. These little syringes are great. I use them for so many things around the house. They come in very handy for measuring out small amounts of fluid. Now I'm just going to take my time and add my oil, making sure I don't spill any of it. And the reason you need to have it unhooked like this is so air can flow freely through it, so you don't get air bubbles in it and so forth. And it's just going to take a little bit of time. Sometimes you might need to move the hose up and down a little bit like that to free up a little bubble in the middle of the hose. And just continue on. Okay, so essentially I have filled this entire hose up with my oil. Oddly enough, the hose holds pretty much 50 milliliters, which works out perfect for me. Now, there are less messy ways of doing this. You can get 1 ounce charged cans and you can inject it much like a can of regular refrigerant. But the reason I don't like to do that is because it's hard to find that type of oil that's just straight PAG 46 oil. Most of the time it has additives in there, and I don't want any additives. I just want straight PAG 46 plus a little bit of dye. So that's why I went to the trouble of doing it this way. So now all I have to do is just going to put this in right back on the manifold over there, screw it on nice and tight, and then put the other end on the can of refrigerant. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so I just got my gauge set moved up top there where I can see it a little bit better. And I've got my yellow hose connected to my can of refrigerant now. My car takes R134A, which is what most cars take nowadays, unless it's a very new one, say made after 2021. But other than that, most cars take R134A. And this is straight refrigerant, no additives, which is exactly what I want. So now all we're going to do is we're going to start the car and turn our AC on high. And now I've got my air conditioner turned on and it's on max recirculation. Now I'm going to proceed on with puncturing this can by turning my valve down. Okay, so ordinarily we would want to purge this yellow line of any air, but since this line is filled end to end with oil, there's no need to do that in this case. So right now my system is still under vacuum and my can is pressurized, so when I open this low pressure valve, it's going to go in pretty quick. Now I'm just going to open my valve on my can of refrigerant and I'm feeling it go in. And I'm just going to give it a little shake and keep it upright. And I can watch up there in my little sight glass and I can see the refrigerant going in. And there, my brand new compressor just clicked on, so I feel pretty good about that. And my gauges are coming up and my can is getting really cold. That's exactly what I want. And just as a note, we're only adding refrigerant to our low side. The high side stays shut. And sometimes if you feel like that the refrigerant has stalled, sometimes if you just play with the valve on top of this can, you'll find another spot where it seems like it'll break loose and continue on. My theory is it may be icing up in there. But that can is icing up pretty good. It's getting so cold I can barely hold it. So we're going to wait for this can to finish up, and then I'll have to add a little bit more. My system requires anywhere between 13.2 ounces and 15 ounces. So I'm going to put this whole can in plus another 3 ounces out of another can. Putting a fan in front of your car really helps speed the process up. All right, second can going in. Okay, I got 3 ounces out of that second can, which made a total of 15 ounces. My gauges are pretty much right where they need to be. Pretty happy with that. My compressor is cycling on like it should. Oh yeah, that is some cold AC right there, buddy. That makes all this trouble well worth it. Okay, so I think that wraps things up. Don't forget to check out the other video that I'll link to down in the description about the step-by-step process of doing an evac and recharge. I went through more detail than what I did just now. So if you're brand new to this, definitely go check out that video. Other than that, that's it, guys. I'm very happy with the repair. The compressor installation went just fine. The installation of the condenser with receiver dryer went just as planned, as well as our expansion valve. So I hope you've learned something today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope that you now have the courage to go replace the compressor, the condenser, and the expansion valve on your car, should you have to do it. It's not as hard as it looks, and you can save yourself a ton by doing it all by yourself. And it really is a DIY, do-it-yourself job. I've got links down in the description for all the parts that I used and the tools that I used, so go check that out. You might find some of it useful, some of it helpful, and thanks so much for watching.